Welcome, my dear listener. Tonight, I shall tell you of an age when the world was young and the stars were closer to men's hearts. I have walked this earth for many ages, and in that time I have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of religions, and the slow turning of seasons that mortals count as centuries. But of all the threads woven through the tapestry of human civilization, few are as ancient, as persistent, or as misunderstood as the slender green plant you know as cannabis. Let me carry you back, far back, to a time when the world was younger than memory itself. Picture, if you will, the northeastern plateau of what you now call Tibet, where the air grows thin and the mountains scrape the belly of heaven. It is cold here, bitterly so, and the wind carries with it the scent of snow and stone. This is a place where only the hardiest plants dare to grow, their roots clinging stubbornly to rocky soil, their leaves reaching toward a sun that offers light but precious little warmth. It was here, some 27 million years ago, long before your kind walked upright, long before you learned to speak or dream, that a curious genus of plants began to take shape. They were humble things at first, these ancestors of cannabis, cousins to the hop plant that would one day flavor your beer. But the harshness of this high plateau demanded adaptation. And so these plants developed something extraordinary. Chemical compounds we now call cannabinoids, oils and resins designed to shield their delicate flowers from the brutal mountain sun and the hungry mouths of herbivores. For millions of years, these plants grew in silence, noticed by no one, their secret chemistry evolving in the cold winds of the Tibetan heights. And then, in what to me seems like the blink of an eye, though to you it would be 12,000 years, something changed. Humans discovered agriculture. I remember those early days of cultivation, when your ancestors were still learning the rhythms of the seasons, still teaching themselves to coax food from the earth, rather than merely taking what nature offered. It was in East Asia, in the lands that would become Mongolia and China, that someone, a woman perhaps, with dirt beneath her, fingernails and seeds tucked into a leather pouch, first looked at the wild cannabis plant and saw not merely a weed but possibility. She did not smoke it, this first cultivator. She did not yet know of the compounds hidden within its flowers, the mysterious oils that could unlock doors in the human mind. No, what she saw was far more practical, far more immediate. She saw the plant's tough, fibrous stalks and imagined rope. She saw its oily seeds and imagined food, sustenance for the long winter months when game grew scarce. And so, with patient hands and countless seasons of trial and error, your kind began the slow dance of domestication. You saved the seeds from the strongest plants, the ones with the thickest fibers and the most abundant seeds. You planted them near your settlements, protected them from wild animals, watered them in times of drought. Generation by generation, the plant changed, shaped by human desire, until it was no longer quite wild, no longer quite the same creature that had grown on the Tibetan plateau. I have watched this happen many times, with many plants and animals. Wheat and barley, sheep and cattle, all were transformed by your ancestors' patient selection, bent slowly to human will. But cannabis was special. Cannabis, you see, was one of the very first, one of the oldest partnerships between your kind and the green world. In those early Neolithic villages, cannabis was everywhere. The women wove its fibers into rough cloth, the first textiles your kind ever made that were not animal skins. The men twisted those same fibers into rope, strong enough to bind a shelter, to haul a load, to tether a beast. The seeds were ground into meal or pressed for their oil, which burned in crude lamps and flavored simple foods. It was humble work, but essential. Without cannabis fiber, those early farmers could not have built the permanent settlements that marked the beginning of civilization. Without its seeds, many would have starved in lean times. The plant was not yet sacred, not yet mysterious. It was simply useful, as necessary as wheat or water. But I have lived long enough to know that utility is merely the beginning of any great story. For, even in those early days, even as your ancestors ground cannabis seeds for their evening meal and wove its fibers by firelight, some among them must have noticed something curious. When the plant flowered, when its sticky, resinous buds ripened in the summer heat, it released a peculiar fragrance, sharp, herbal, slightly sweet. And if someone happened to throw those flowers onto a fire, perhaps to dispose of them, perhaps merely by accident, the smoke that rose from the flames carried that fragrance into the night air. And anyone who breathed that smoke, even innocently, even without intention, felt ... different. I imagine the first person to experience this must have been terribly confused. There was no word yet for intoxication, no cultural framework for understanding what was happening. All they knew was that the world had suddenly become more vivid, more alive. Colors seemed brighter. Sounds carried new depths. The crackling of the fire was music. The patterns in the flames were stories. The stars overhead, always constant, now seemed to pulse with meaning. Perhaps they were frightened. Perhaps they laughed. Perhaps they sat in silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, and wondered if the gods had touched them, or if they had somehow touched the gods. Whatever that first reaction was, it marked a turning point. Humanity had discovered something profound, though it would take millennia to understand what, hidden within this useful plant, this source of fiber and food, was a key, a chemical key that could unlock doors in the human mind, doors that led to places strange and wonderful and sometimes terrifying. But I am getting ahead of myself. That discovery, that first deliberate inhalation of cannabis smoke, would not come for thousands of years yet. For now, in those early Neolithic villages, the plant remained what it had always been, a gift from the earth, a tool for survival, a thread in the great weaving of human civilization. And already, even then, it was traveling. Chapter 2: The Weaver's Gift. As the centuries unfolded like the petals of a slow-blooming flower, cannabis spread from its birthplace in East Asia, carried by the hands of farmers, merchants, and wanderers. I watched as it moved along ancient trails, following the migrations of your ancestors, adapting to new climates, new soils, new purposes. In China, which, even in those ancient days, was a land of remarkable ingenuity, the plant found perhaps its most devoted cultivators. The Chinese did not merely use cannabis, they studied it, refined it, and transformed it into something approaching art. I recall walking through a village in what you would now call the Yellow River Valley, perhaps 5,000 years ago. The morning mist clung to the ground, and the air was filled with the rhythmic sound of looms clacking, their wooden frames singing as nimble fingers worked hemp fiber into cloth. The fabric they produced was rough by modern standards, coarse against the skin. But to those people it was nothing short of miraculous, stronger than anything made from plant fibers they had known before. More durable than leather, and unlike animal skins, it could be produced without taking a life. The women who worked those looms knew every variety of hemp by touch alone. They could feel the difference between summer-harvested fiber and autumn-harvested, could judge the quality of the retting process, that careful, controlled rot that separated the usable fibers from the woody core by running a strand between their fingers. Their knowledge was passed down, mother to daughter, a quiet wisdom that shaped the very fabric of civilization. But it was not only cloth that hemp provided. I have seen men twist its fibers into rope, so strong it could lift stones for temple walls, so durable it lasted for decades, even when exposed to rain and sun. I have watched fishermen weave nets from hemp that could haul in catches large enough to feed an entire village. The plant's utility seemed endless, bounded only by human imagination. And then, somewhere around the year you would call 1500 BCE, something extraordinary happened. Some curious soul, perhaps a scholar, perhaps a bureaucrat, discovered that hemp fiber, when properly processed, could be beaten and pressed into sheets thin enough, smooth enough, to receive the marks of a brush dipped in ink. Paper. The Chinese had invented paper, and cannabis was its foundation. I remember the first time I saw writing on hemp paper. It was in the library of a minor official, a man whose name history has forgotten, but whose contribution to human knowledge was incalculable. The characters flowed across the page in elegant columns, recording tax receipts, genealogies, astronomical observations, all the mundane and magnificent details of human life. And beneath those characters, giving them permanence, giving them immortality, was cannabis fiber. Do you understand what this meant? Before paper, knowledge was fragile. It lived in human memory, passed down through oral tradition, subject to all the distortions and losses that memory entails. Or it was carved into stone, expensive and immovable, accessible only to the wealthy and powerful. But paper was different. Paper was cheap enough that even common scholars could afford it, light enough to carry, durable enough to last centuries if properly cared for. Paper democratized knowledge. It made possible the great libraries, the vast bureaucracies, the accumulated wisdom of generations. And at the heart of that revolution was cannabis, the same plant that farmers had once valued merely for its edible seeds. But even this was not the end of cannabis's gifts to Chinese civilization. For the Chinese, who seemed to find a use for everything nature provided, discovered that the plant had military applications as well. In those days, archery was the foundation of warfare. An army's strength was measured not in swords or spears, but in its bowmen, and the power of a bow depended entirely on the strength and flexibility of its string. Traditional bowstrings, made from bamboo fiber or animal sinew, served well enough, but they had limitations. They grew weak when wet. They snapped in cold weather. They lacked the perfect combination of strength and elasticity that would allow an arrow to fly its farthest. Hemp, the Chinese discovered, solved all these problems. A bowstring made from properly processed hemp fiber was stronger than bamboo, more weather-resistant than sinew, and had exactly the right amount of give to propel an arrow with maximum force. I have watched archers test these strings, seen arrows fly distances that would have been impossible with older technology. Some military historians whispered that hemp gave the Chinese Empire a decisive advantage in its early wars, that the conquest of neighboring lands was made possible, in part, by the superior range of hemp-strung bows. The Chinese even gave it a name, their first war crop, not wheat, which fed soldiers. not horses, which carried them into battle, but cannabis, which gave their archers the edge they needed to dominate the battlefield. And yet, for all its industrial and military applications, the plant remained in the realm of the practical, the mundane. It was material, not magical, tool, not teacher. That would change, but slowly as mountains erode and rivers carve their paths to the sea. By the time a millennium had passed, hemp was woven into the very fabric of Chinese life, literally and figuratively. It clothed the peasants and the nobles alike. It carried water from wells and held together the beams of houses. It recorded the wisdom of sages and the commands of emperors. It launched arrows that defended borders and expanded territories. And in every home, in every village, the plant grew in gardens and fields, as common as rice, as essential as air. The Chinese had taken a wild plant from the mountains and made it the foundation of their civilization. They had domesticated it so thoroughly that most had forgotten it had ever been wild at all. But I had not forgotten. I remembered the cold plateau where it began, the wind-swept heights where it first learned to produce its strange resins. And I knew, with the certainty that comes from having watched countless human stories unfold, that those resins would not remain hidden forever. Somewhere, someone would discover what lay waiting in the flowers. And when they did, everything would change. Chapter 3. The smoke that speaks to gods. The turning came, as so many turnings do, not in the halls of power or the temples of the wise, but in the wild places among the people who lived closest to the earth and sky. Picture the Eurasian steppe in the time you would call the first millennium before the Common Era. It is a landscape that stretches from horizon to horizon, an ocean of grass broken only by the occasional stand of trees, the rare outcropping of stones. The sky here is vast, impossibly vast, and at night the stars are so thick they seem to form a glowing river across the darkness. This was the home of the Scythians, and I remember them well. They were horse peoples, nomadic herders who moved with the seasons, following the grass that fed their animals. They lived in felt tents that could be packed up in hours, owned nothing that could not be carried on horseback, and measured wealth not in land or buildings, but in livestock and fine metalwork. They were also, by the standards of the settled peoples to their south, terrifying. The Greeks called them barbarians. The Persians feared their raids. Even the mighty Chinese built walls to keep them out. For the Scythians were warriors, every man and woman trained from childhood in the arts of horsemanship and archery. They could shoot accurately from a galloping horse, wheel, and retreat faster than any infantry could pursue, and strike at settlements before defenders could even raise an alarm. But I knew them as something more than mere raiders. The Scythians possessed a deep spiritual life, a connection to the unseen world that manifested in elaborate rituals, in beautifully crafted golden ornaments, in burials so rich with grave goods that archaeologists thousands of years in your future would marvel at them. And it was the Scythians, these horse warriors of the steppe, who first taught humanity the deliberate use of cannabis as a doorway to the divine. I was there, in spirit, if not in flesh, when one such ritual took place. It was autumn, and a chieftain had died, a man of great renown, whose courage in battle and wisdom in council had earned him the respect of his tribe. His body had been prepared according to custom, his favorite weapons and jewelry placed beside him, his best horses sacrificed so they could carry him in the afterlife. But before the burial mound was sealed, Before the earth covered him forever, there would be a ceremony. The men of his clan, 20 warriors, perhaps, their faces already marked with the ritual cuts of mourning, gathered around a curious structure. It was simple, really, wooden poles driven into the earth, covered with felt to form a small tent barely tall enough for a man to sit upright inside. I watched as they placed a bronze vessel in the center of this tent, a beautiful thing decorated with images of deer and griffins. Into this vessel they poured hot stones, glowing red from a nearby fire, and then, with ceremonial solemnity, they produced leather bags filled with cannabis flowers, not the stalks or seeds they used for rope and food, but the sticky, resinous buds that grew at the plant's crown. They threw handfuls onto the hot stones. The smoke that rose was immediate and thick, pungent and sweet. It filled the felt tent in seconds, escaping only through the small gaps in the fabric. And one by one, the warriors crawled inside. What happened in that tent would be described centuries later by Herodotus, the Greek historian, though he heard the tale secondhand and got some details wrong. He wrote that the Scythians howled with pleasure, a phrase that suggests wild abandon, uncontrolled ecstasy. But I was there, in a way that mortal historians could never be, and I can tell you, it was not quite like that. Yes, there was pleasure. How could there not be? When the mind suddenly opened like a flower, when thoughts that had been locked away came flooding forth in glorious profusion. But there was also something deeper, something sacred. For the Scythians did not breathe this smoke for mere recreation. This was not a party, not an entertainment. This was communion with the dead, with the ancestors, with the vast invisible world that they believed surrounded the visible one. In that smoke-filled tent, the boundaries grew thin. The warriors felt the presence of their fallen chieftain, heard his voice in their minds, received his guidance for the trials ahead. Some wept, some laughed, some sat in profound silence, their eyes fixed on nothing, seeing visions that would guide them for years to come. And when at last they emerged, stumbling slightly, blinking in the harsh sunlight, they were changed. They had touched something beyond the everyday, beyond the mundane concerns of herding and raiding and survival. They had touched the infinite. This practice spread among the steppe peoples, carried along the same trade routes that brought silk and spices, jade and gold. Other tribes adopted it, adapted it, made it their own. Some used it only for funerals, others for healing rituals, still others before battle, seeking courage and clarity from the sacred smoke. And slowly, inevitably, the practice moved southward and eastward, into the lands of settled peoples, of farmers and craftsmen and priests. It reached India, where it would find perhaps its most enthusiastic welcome. It touched China, where it would be woven into the mystical practices of early Taoism. It even, eventually, would drift westward into Persia and beyond. But everywhere it went, it carried the same essential truth that the Scythians had discovered. Within this plant, within its flowers and resins, was a key that could unlock doors in the human mind, doors that led to ecstasy and insight, to visions and revelations, to a direct experience of the numinous that no amount of prayer or meditation seemed able to replicate quite so reliably. Of course, not everyone who used cannabis experienced profound spiritual revelations. Many simply felt relaxed, amused, detached from their ordinary concerns. The plant affected different people in different ways, and its effects depended on countless factors: the variety of cannabis used, the amount consumed, the mental state of the user. the setting in which it was used. But even the simplest experience of cannabis intoxication carried within it a seed of wonder, for it proved, in a way that nothing else quite could, that consciousness was not fixed, that the mind could be altered, that reality itself was more fluid and mysterious than everyday experience suggested. Your ancestors, confronting this truth, responded in the only way they could. They made it sacred. They wrapped it in ritual and taboo, in prayers and prohibitions. They placed it in the hands of shamans and priests, people specially trained to navigate these altered states, to bring back wisdom from the invisible world. And cannabis, which had begun its journey as a simple source of fiber and food, now added another role to its growing portfolio: teacher, guide, doorway to the divine. The Scythians, those fierce horse warriors of the steppes, gave humanity this gift, and though their civilization would eventually fade, though their language would be forgotten and their burial mounds plundered, their discovery would echo across the millennia, shaping religions and philosophies, inspiring mystics and poets, and permanently altering humanity's relationship with this ancient green plant. Chapter 4: The Sacred and the Profane. While the Scythians were breathing sacred smoke on the wind-swept steppes, far to the south, in the warm lands of the Indian subcontinent, cannabis was undergoing yet another transformation. Here, it would become not merely a tool for occasional ritual, but something woven into the very fabric of religious life. I remember India in those ancient days, the Vedic period, as scholars would later call it. It was a time of profound spiritual fermentation, when the foundations of Hinduism were being laid, when the great hymns that would become the Vedas were being composed and memorized and passed down through generations of priests. The land itself seemed designed for contemplation. Vast river valleys where water and earth conspired to produce abundance. Forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. Places where ascetics could retreat from the world and seek enlightenment in solitude. Mountains in the north where yogis sat in caves, their breath slowing to a crawl, their minds diving deep into meditation. And everywhere, growing wild or cultivated in gardens, was cannabis. The Indians called it by many names: bhang, ganja, charas, each referring to different preparations of the plant. But regardless of name, its use was widespread, accepted, and most importantly, sacred. I have sat with Brahmin priests as they recited the Atharvaveda, that fourth and final collection of Vedic hymns. In it, cannabis is listed as one of the 5 sacred plants mentioned in the same breath as kusha grass and barley. The text speaks of it as a liberator, a plant that releases humans from anxiety and grants them joy. Some scholars believe it was an ingredient in soma, that mysterious ritual drink that features so prominently in Vedic literature, though others dispute this. The truth, I suspect, lies somewhere in the middle. Cannabis was one of several plants used in different preparations of soma, depending on region and custom. But whether or not it was the soma of the Vedas, cannabis certainly became central to Hindu spiritual practice. The association with Lord Shiva, one of the principal deities of Hinduism, made this inevitable. Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, the lord of meditation and dance, the ascetic who sits in eternal contemplation on Mount Kailash. The mythology surrounding Shiva and cannabis is ancient beyond reckoning, and like most mythology, it contains many layers of truth wrapped in symbol. One tale tells of how Shiva, fleeing from a family quarrel, sought refuge in a cannabis field. Exhausted and overwhelmed, he lay down in the shade of the plants, and fell asleep. When he awoke, curious about the plants that had sheltered him, he ate some of the leaves. The experience that followed refreshed him so thoroughly that cannabis became his favorite food, and he became known as the Lord of Bang. Another version says that cannabis emerged from the churning of the cosmic ocean, a gift from the gods to humanity, and Shiva immediately recognized its value as an aid to meditation and spiritual practice. Whatever the original story, and I have heard dozens of variations over the millennia, the association stuck. Shiva's devotees, the sadhus and yogis who renounced worldly life to pursue spiritual enlightenment, adopted cannabis as a sacrament. I have watched them, these wandering holy men, gathering in temples and ashrams, passing clay cups of bang from hand to hand, chanting prayers to Shiva as the preparation took effect. Bang, I should explain, was not smoked in those early days. The Indians prepared it as a beverage, grinding cannabis leaves with milk and spices, creating a thick, green drink that was consumed during religious festivals and ceremonies. The effect was slower than smoking, more gradual, but no less profound. Within an hour of drinking, bang, a sense of peace and well-being would wash over the drinker. Colors became more vivid, music became more moving, prayer became easier, meditation deeper. The yogis used it as a tool for transcendence. They believed, and many still believe, that cannabis could help quiet the chattering mind, that constant stream of thoughts and worries that prevents most humans from experiencing the true nature of reality. In their cosmology, the goal of spiritual practice was to break free from the cycle of birth and death, to achieve moksha, liberation from the wheel of karma. And cannabis, used properly, with intention and discipline, could aid in that quest. But cannabis in India was never limited to ascetics and mystics. It also became part of ordinary religious life, woven into the social fabric in ways both sacred and surprisingly mundane. During festivals like Holi, the spring celebration of colors, bang was consumed by entire communities. Young and old men and women all would drink the preparation and then engage in the joyous chaos of the festival, throwing colored powder at each other, singing, dancing, forgetting for a few hours the strict social hierarchies that normally governed their lives. At weddings, bang was served to guests as a blessing, a wish for joy and prosperity. Before difficult journeys, travelers might consume it for courage. Soldiers drank it before battle. Farmers offered it to each other during harvest, a way of celebrating the completion of hard work. The medical establishment, such as it was, also embraced cannabis. Ayurvedic physicians, practitioners of India's traditional medicine system, prescribed it for dozens of ailments: chronic pain, epilepsy, digestive troubles, insomnia, anxiety. All were treated with various cannabis preparations. They recognized that the plant affected both body and mind, that it could ease physical suffering while also lifting spiritual malaise. I have read the ancient Ayurvedic texts, those palm leaf manuscripts that recorded centuries of accumulated medical wisdom. In them, cannabis appears again and again, its properties carefully catalogued, its dosages precisely specified for different conditions and different constitutions. The physicians understood that cannabis was powerful, that it needed to be used with care and knowledge. Too much could cause confusion and anxiety. Too little might have no effect at all. But in the right dose, for the right patient, it could be genuinely healing. What strikes me most about cannabis use in ancient India was its integration into all levels of society. It was not hidden, not forbidden, not associated with crime or degeneracy. A sadhu smoking cannabis in a temple courtyard was engaged in spiritual practice. A farmer drinking bhang at a wedding was participating in a blessed celebration. A physician prescribing it for pain was offering effective medicine. The plant had achieved something rare in human history. It was simultaneously sacred and ordinary, mystical and practical, a gift from the gods and a simple agricultural product. This balance would not last forever. Nothing in human affairs ever does. But for a time, for many centuries, India showed what it looked like when a society embraced cannabis without fear or prohibition. And the wisdom of those ancient Ayurvedic physicians, their understanding of cannabis as medicine, would eventually travel westward, influencing Persian physicians, then Greek doctors, then Roman healers, spreading slowly but steadily across the ancient world. But I am, once again, getting ahead of myself. We must first journey to China, where cannabis was about to enter yet another phase of its long relationship with humanity. Chapter 5. The Philosopher's Herb in China. Cannabis had been useful for millennia, rope and paper, bowstrings and fabric. But around the time you would call 1,000 years before the Common Era, a new movement was stirring in Chinese thought, a philosophy that would eventually be called Taoism, and cannabis would find yet another purpose. The early Taoists were seekers, people unsatisfied with the rigid structures of Confucian society, with its emphasis on duty, hierarchy, and social order. They looked instead to nature for guidance, to the Tao, the way, that nameless, indefinable principle that underlies all existence. They sought to align themselves with this natural flow, to achieve wu-wei, effortless action, to live in harmony with the rhythms of the cosmos. And they discovered that cannabis, consumed intentionally, could help them in this quest. I have walked through the mountains of China, where early Taoist hermits made their homes. Caves carved into cliff faces, simple huts built beside mountain streams. These were places of profound silence, broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant call of cranes. Here, far from the noise and bustle of cities, the Taoists meditated, practiced breathing exercises, studied the ancient texts, and sought the secrets of immortality. Immortality, to them, was not mere longevity, though that was certainly desired. It was a transformation of the self, a refinement of key life energy, until the practitioner became something more than merely human, a Xian, an immortal being who could travel between earth and heaven, who had transcended the ordinary limitations of mortal existence. Cannabis played a role in these practices, though the exact nature of that role was often shrouded in poetic language and deliberate obscurity. The Taoists were not interested in writing instruction manuals. They preferred cryptic verses, metaphors, hints that could only be understood by those already far along the path. Some texts speak of fire, hemp, or cannabis smoke as tools for achieving mystical states. Taoist practitioners would burn cannabis in bronze censers, inhaling the smoke while in deep meditation. The effect, they believed, helped them communicate with spirits, allowed them to perceive realms of existence normally hidden from mortal eyes. I remember sitting beside an old Taoist monk. This was perhaps 2,000 years ago, in a small temple complex in the Washan Mountains. He was preparing for a ritual, carefully measuring out dried cannabis flowers, grinding them with other herbs, whose names I have long forgotten. When I asked him about the practice, he smiled in that infuriatingly mysterious way Taoist masters have. The plant, he said, loosens the bonds that tie consciousness to the body. It opens what we call the gates of perception. But, double quotes, he paused, placing the mixture into an ornate censer. But it is only a tool, a raft, to cross the river. Once you have crossed, you must leave the raft behind. He lit the mixture, and soon fragrant smoke began to curl upward. He breathed it in, slowly, deliberately, his eyes half closed. For a long time, he sat motionless, so still that he barely seemed to breathe. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from a great distance, he began to chant verses from the Dea De Jing, that foundational Taoist text. What he experienced in that moment, I cannot say with certainty. The Taoists were notoriously reluctant to speak plainly about such things. But I watched his face, saw a peace settle over it that went deeper than mere relaxation, a serenity that seemed to emanate from some profound inner equilibrium. When he emerged from his meditation, hours later, he spoke to me of visions, not hallucinations, exactly, but a heightened perception of the interconnectedness of all things. He had felt, he said, the Tao moving through him and through all creation, a ceaseless flow of change and transformation. The boundaries between self and world had become fluid, permeable. For a time, he had been not a separate being, but part of the great cosmic dance. The plant teaches, he told me, but it is not the teacher. The Tao is the teacher. Cannabis, merely, clears the dust from our eyes so we can see what was always there. This understanding that cannabis was a tool, not an end in itself, characterized much of Taoist practice. They were careful users, deliberate. Too much, they knew, could cloud rather than clarify. The goal was not intoxication, but illumination, not escape, but insight. The Chinese character for hemp, ma, also means numb or anesthesia, and this dual meaning hints at another dimension of cannabis use in China. For alongside its spiritual applications, the plant was being used medically, particularly in surgery. The legendary surgeon Hua Tu, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, was said to have performed complex operations using an anesthetic called mofissin, literally, cannabis boiling powder. He would mix cannabis resin with wine and other herbs, have the patient drink it, and once they were sufficiently numb and drowsy, he would cut into their body to remove tumors, repair injuries, even operate on internal organs. Whether these accounts are literally true or embellished by legend is difficult to say. Medical practices of that era were not well documented, and much knowledge was lost. But that such stories were told, that Hua Tu's name became associated with cannabis-aided surgery, tells us something important. The Chinese recognized that cannabis could affect more than just the mind. It could numb physical pain, could render the body insensible to suffering in ways that made previously impossible procedures feasible. This medical knowledge would persist in China for centuries, passed down through medical lineages, recorded in pharmacopoeia alongside countless other herbal remedies. Cannabis tinctures for pain, cannabis poultices for wounds, cannabis preparations to calm nervous ailments, all were part of traditional Chinese medicine's extensive toolkit. But perhaps the most significant legacy of cannabis in Chinese culture was its complete integration into daily life. It was not exotic, not foreign, not strange. It had been part of Chinese civilization for so long that it was as unremarkable as tea or rice. Farmers grew it, physicians prescribed it, philosophers contemplated its effects, and everyone wore clothing made from its fibers. This ordinariness, this lack of stigma or taboo, allowed the Chinese to explore cannabis's various properties without the moral panic that would later grip other cultures. They could study it scientifically, use it medically, explore it spiritually, all while maintaining a practical awareness of its limitations and potential dangers. It was, in short, a plant, a useful plant, a powerful plant, but still just a plant. Not a demon, not a god, but a gift from nature that, like all of nature's gifts, required wisdom in its use. And that wisdom would be needed, for cannabis was about to embark on its longest journey yet, spreading from East Asia across the vast expanse of Eurasia, carried by traders and conquerors, mystics and merchants, until there was hardly a civilization on Earth that had not encountered this ancient green companion of humanity. Chapter 6: The Roads of Silk and Smoke. If you spread a map before me and ask me to trace the single most important network in the ancient world, I would not point to the Roman roads or the sea lanes that connected ports around the Mediterranean. No, I would trace my finger along the Silk Road, that impossibly long chain of trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean, the East to the West, spanning deserts and mountains, oases and empires. The Silk Road was never a single road, of course. It was a web, a network, dozens of routes that split and merged, that varied with season and politics, that existed as much in the minds of merchants as on any physical map. But along all these routes, in the saddlebags of caravans and the holds of ships, traveled goods from every corner of the known world: silk and spices, jewels and jade, horses and precious metals, and cannabis. The plant moved westward, slowly, carried by the same mechanisms that spread Buddhism and gunpowder, paper and tea. A merchant from Samarkand would buy hemp rope in China, use it to secure his cargo, and sell it in Persia. A wandering Buddhist monk would carry cannabis seeds, planting them at monasteries along his route, knowing they would produce useful fiber and oil. Nomadic tribes, moving seasonally across the grasslands, would trade cannabis preparations with settled peoples, exchanging the plant's gifts for grain and metalwork. But what moved along the Silk Road was not merely cannabis itself. Ideas moved to knowledge, techniques. The Scythian practice of ritual smoke inhalation made its way into Persian ceremony. Indian medical knowledge about cannabis's therapeutic properties influenced Greek physicians. Chinese methods of hemp cultivation improved agricultural practices from Mesopotamia to Egypt. I have stood at the crossroads of the Silk Road, in cities whose names sing like poetry: Samarkand and Bukhara, Kashgar and Merv. These were places where cultures collided and mingled, where Chinese silk merchants haggled with Persian gem traders, where Indian philosophers debated with Greek skeptics, where ideas and goods from half the world came together in bustling marketplaces that smelled of spices and rang with a dozen languages. And in every one of these cities, cannabis had a presence. In Persia, the plant became associated with Zoroastrian priests who burned it as incense during religious ceremonies, believing the smoke carried prayers to Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of light and wisdom. I have watched these rituals, the priests in their white robes standing before sacred fires, adding cannabis to the flames, along with frankincense and myrrh, the smoke rising in fragrant columns toward the heavens. The Persians were sophisticated in their understanding of cannabis. Their physicians, building on knowledge from both India and their own observations, wrote extensively about the plant's properties. They recognized its ability to ease pain, to calm troubled minds, to aid sleep, but they also noted its dangers, that excessive use could lead to lethargy, to clouded judgment, to a withdrawal from the world that was antithetical to the Zoroastrian emphasis on active engagement in the cosmic battle between good and evil. It was in Persia, too, that cannabis gained its most enduring Arabic name, hashish. This word, derived from the Arabic root for grass or herb, originally referred simply to dried plant material. But over time, it came to specifically mean the concentrated resin of cannabis, pressed into cakes or balls, far more potent than the dried flowers or leaves. The production of hashish was an art form in the medieval Islamic world. I have watched craftsmen in Morocco and Afghanistan perfect their techniques over generations. They would take female cannabis plants at the peak of their flowering, when the flowers were heavy with sticky resin, and dry them carefully in the shade. Then, using various methods, rubbing the flowers between hands, sieving them through silk screens, washing them in ice-cold water, they would separate the resin glands from the plant material. What remained was hashish, a concentrated essence of cannabis, dark and aromatic, that could be smoked in small amounts or mixed with tobacco, eaten or brewed into tea. It was far more potent than the preparations used in ancient India or Scythia, and its effects were correspondingly more intense. The spread of Islam across North Africa and into Europe carried hashish with it. In the great cities of the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad and Cairo, Cordoba and Damascus, hashish found both devotees and detractors. Sufi mystics, those seekers after divine union, who stood somewhat apart from mainstream Islamic practice, adopted it as an aid to meditation and ecstatic states. They would gather in Zavia's Sufi lodges and pass the hashish pipe from hand to hand, chanting the names of God, seeking to lose themselves in divine love. I remember one such gathering in a Zavia in Cairo, perhaps 800 years ago. The air was thick with hashish smoke and incense. The Sufis sat in a circle, their eyes half closed, swaying gently as they chanted, Allah, 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 ... The repetition was hypnotic, designed to empty the mind of all thought except awareness of the divine presence, and the hashish, they believed, helped dissolve the barriers of ego that stood between them and union with God. The sheikh who led this gathering, a man of great learning and deeper compassion, explained their practice to me. The self, he said, his voice soft but clear, is a veil that hides God from us. Our practices, prayer, fasting, meditation, and yes, the sacred herb, all serve to thin that veil, to make it translucent so that divine light can shine through. But not all Muslims accepted this view. Conservative Islamic scholars issued fatwas against hashish, condemning it as an intoxicant forbidden by the Prophet's prohibition against wine. Some rulers went further, imposing harsh punishments on hashish users. I witnessed, in the year you would call 1378, the edict of the Emir Sadun Shikuni in Arabia, who decreed that anyone caught using hashish would have their teeth pulled out. A punishment meant not merely to cause pain, but to make future smoking difficult or impossible. These prohibitions were never entirely successful. Hashish use continued in underground spaces, in private homes, in the corners of society where official authority could not quite reach, but the stigma stuck. In the Islamic world, cannabis became associated with rebellion, with mysticism that bordered on heresy, with a refusal to accept conventional authority. Yet even as some rejected it, others embraced it with scholarly rigor. The great Persian physician Avicenna, whose canon of medicine would influence European medical practice for centuries, devoted considerable attention to cannabis. He documented its uses for headaches, edema, inflammatory conditions, and various types of pain. His writing was precise, clinical, based on careful observation of patients over many years. The drug, Avicenna wrote, has both hot and cold qualities, and affects both body and soul. In proper dosage, it can ease suffering and bring rest to troubled minds. But excessive use weakens the spirit and clouds judgment, and those who habitually use it may find themselves unable to function without it. This balanced view, recognizing both therapeutic value and potential for harm, characterized the best of Islamic medical scholarship. These physicians were not moralists or crusaders, they were scientists, in the truest sense, seeking to understand the natural world and apply that understanding to the relief of human suffering. The canon of medicine, along with other Arabic medical texts, eventually made their way to Europe, translated into Latin by scholars working in places like Toledo and Palermo, where Christian and Islamic worlds overlapped. And through these translations, European physicians learned about cannabis and its medical applications, planting seeds that would bloom centuries later. But before we turn our attention to Europe, we must acknowledge one final chapter in cannabis's journey along the Silk Road: the legend of the assassins. The Nizari Ismailis were a Shia Muslim sect that established a network of mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria during the 11th and 12th centuries. They became famous, or infamous, for their political murders, killing prominent Sunni leaders who threatened their survival. Their most notorious stronghold was Alamat, the Eagle's Nest, a fortress carved into a mountain peak that seemed impregnable. The legend that grew up around them claimed that their leader, Hassan-I Seba, controlled his followers through a combination of religious fervor and hashish. The story went that he would drug young men with hashish, then transport them while unconscious to a hidden garden of exquisite beauty, filled with fountains and flowers, music and dancing maidens. When they awoke, they would believe they had been granted a vision of paradise. Hassan would then promise them eternal paradise if they died carrying out his orders, and threaten them with denial of that paradise if they refused. The tale was dramatic, compelling, and almost certainly false. It was propaganda, created by the enemies of the Nizari Ismailis, to explain how such a small sect could instill such fanatical loyalty in its members. The reality was likely far more mundane: skilled training, genuine religious devotion, and the kind of absolute commitment that comes from believing one is serving God's will. But the legend persisted, and it gave the world a new word: the Arabic hashishin, supposedly meaning hashish users, mutated as it passed through Italian and French until it became assassin, a term that has echoed down through the centuries, forever linking cannabis with violence and murder in the Western imagination. This was deeply unfair to cannabis, which had nothing to do with the Nizari Ismailis methods or motives. But fairness has never been history's strong suit. The association, once made, proved impossible to break. Even today, many people who hear the word assassin have no idea of its supposed etymology, no knowledge that it traces back to a medieval Muslim sect and a probably fictional story about hashish and paradise gardens. The legend of the assassins was cannabis's first great public relations disaster, the first time the plant became associated not with healing or spiritual insight, but with something dark and dangerous. it would not be the last. But that darkness still lay in the future. For now, in the medieval period, cannabis continued its inexorable spread across the globe, adapting to new climates, serving new purposes, woven ever more deeply into the fabric of human civilization. Chapter 7: The Age of Rope and Canvas. While cannabis was gaining mystical and medical reputations in Asia and the Middle East, in Europe it remained what it had been in ancient China, primarily an industrial crop. The Europeans, with their great maritime ambitions, their drive to explore and conquer and trade across vast oceans, needed hemp more than they needed enlightenment. I have stood on the docks of Venice and Genoa, Amsterdam and London, watching ships being outfitted for voyages that would last months or years. The amount of hemp required for a single large ship was staggering. The rigging, all those ropes that controlled the sails, might contain 20 tons of hemp or more. The sails themselves, woven from hemp canvas, the word canvas itself derives from cannabis, could weigh several tons. Hemp was used to caulk the seams between planks, keeping the ocean out. Even the sailors' clothing was often made from hemp, rough and durable, able to withstand salt spray and constant wear. Without hemp, the age of exploration would have been impossible. Christopher Columbus's ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, were floating gardens of hemp. Every rope, every sail, every bit of caulking was cannabis fiber. When Columbus made landfall in the Americas, he did so courtesy of a plant that had traveled with humanity since the very dawn of agriculture. And once Europeans established colonies in the New World, one of the first things they did was plant hemp. The Spanish brought it to Chile in 1545. The English brought it to Jamestown in 1607. It was not optional. Hemp was considered so essential to colonial survival that laws were passed requiring its cultivation. I witnessed the Virginia Assembly in 1619 pass legislation mandating that every farmer grow hemp. It was not a suggestion, it was law. Failure to comply could result in fines or worse. The reasoning was simple. The colony needed rope, needed sailcloth, needed paper. Every farm that didn't produce hemp was a farm that weakened the colony's self-sufficiency. In some colonies, hemp became legal tender. A farmer could pay his taxes in hemp. He could use it to settle debts, purchase goods, even pay for passage to the New World. In Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, hemp was as good as gold, better in some ways, because, unlike gold, it could be grown, harvested, and processed with nothing more than land, labor, and patience. The great figures of early American history were hemp farmers. George Washington grew it at Mount Vernon, keeping detailed records of his hemp cultivation in his agricultural journals. "Make the most of the Indian hemp seed," he wrote, "and sow it everywhere." Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello. He went so far as to say that hemp was a necessity to the wealth and protection of the country, a statement that reflected widespread understanding of the crop's strategic importance. It is worth pausing here to note what these men were growing. This was not the high THC cannabis that would later be called marijuana. These were hemp varieties, bred for fiber, with minimal psychoactive compounds. The colonists were no more interested in getting high than they were in using cotton to make rope. Different varieties of the plant served different purposes, and in Europe and America, the purpose was industrial. That said, knowledge of cannabis's other properties was not entirely absent. European physicians had access to Arabic medical texts, and some experimented with cannabis tinctures and preparations for pain relief and other ailments. But such uses were marginal, confined largely to medical practitioners, and far from the public consciousness. The focus was on fiber. Europe's growing naval power depended on it. The British Navy, which would come to rule the waves, consumed vast quantities of hemp for its ships. Entire regions of the British Isles specialized in hemp cultivation. Russian hemp, particularly from the region around the Black Sea, was considered the finest in the world, and Britain imported thousands of tons of it annually. Losing access to Russian hemp was a strategic disaster. When Napoleon attempted his continental system, trying to cut off British trade with Europe, one of Britain's primary concerns was securing alternative sources of hemp. Wars have been fought over less critical resources. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, hemp remained an agricultural staple across Europe and America. Farmers knew how to grow it, how to harvest it at the right time, how to ret it, that crucial process of controlled rotting that separated fiber from the woody core. They knew which varieties produced the finest fiber, which grew best in their particular soil and climate. But already, changes were beginning that would eventually displace hemp from its position of agricultural prominence. Cotton, grown in the American South with slave labor, was becoming cheaper and more available. New sources of fiber, jute from India, sisal from Central America, entered global markets. And most significantly, the Industrial Revolution was producing new materials, new technologies that would eventually make natural fibers less essential. The first synthetic fibers were still decades away. Nylon, which would revolutionize rope making, would not be invented until the 20th century. But the groundwork was being laid. The economic and technological forces that would eventually relegate hemp to agricultural obscurity. Still, at the dawn of the 19th century, hemp remained one of the most widely cultivated crops in the world. It fed no one, but it clothed millions, built ships, made paper, and served 1,000 other purposes. It was one of the fundamental building blocks of civilization, as essential and unremarkable as wheat or iron. And then something changed. The plant that had been purely industrial for millennia in the West began to reclaim its other identity, the one it had always possessed in the East. Cannabis, the fiber crop, was about to become cannabis, the drug, and that transformation would change everything. Chapter 8: The Physician's Discovery. The reintroduction of cannabis as medicine to the Western world began, as so many things did in that era, with the British Empire. In the 1830s, a young Irish physician named William O'Shaughnessy found himself posted to India as part of the East India Company's medical service. I remember O'Shaughnessy, earnest, curious, possessed of that peculiarly Victorian combination of scientific rigor and imperial confidence. He arrived in Calcutta with the usual prejudices of his time and class, fully expecting to bring the light of modern European medicine to the benighted natives. What he found instead humbled him. Indian physicians, practitioners of Ayurveda, possessed medical knowledge that stretched back thousands of years. They had treatments for conditions that baffled European doctors, techniques and preparations that worked when conventional Western medicine failed. And among those treatments was cannabis. O'Shaughnessy began studying cannabis systematically, approaching it as a scientist rather than a moralist. He read the Sanskrit medical texts, interviewed Ayurvedic physicians, observed their treatments. He conducted experiments on animals to determine the plant's effects and safety. And then, carefully, he began administering cannabis preparations to human patients. The results astonished him. A patient with rabies, facing certain death and terrible suffering, found relief from cannabis tincture. It did not cure the disease. Nothing could, but it eased the agonizing spasms and allowed the patient to die in peace rather than in torment. Patients with tetanus, cholera, rheumatism, and convulsive disorders all showed improvement when treated with cannabis. In 1839, O'Shaughnessy published his findings in a paper titled On the Preparations of the Indian Hemp, or Gunja. It was meticulously detailed, full of case studies and careful observations. He described optimal dosing, noted both benefits and side effects, and argued that cannabis deserved a place in the Western medical pharmacopoeia. His paper was read widely, translated into multiple languages, and sparked enormous interest in the medical community. Here was a drug that seemed to have genuine therapeutic value for conditions that Western medicine struggled to treat. European and American physicians began experimenting with cannabis preparations, and pharmaceutical companies began producing standardized cannabis extracts for medical use. I watched as cannabis medicine spread through the Western world with remarkable speed. By 1850, cannabis had been added to the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of drugs approved for medical use. British pharmaceutical companies like Smith Brothers and Squibb and Sons were manufacturing cannabis tinctures and extracts. Doctors prescribed it routinely for pain, insomnia, migraines, menstrual cramps, and dozens of other conditions. You could walk into any pharmacy in London or New York in the 1880s and purchase cannabis medicine over the counter. No prescription required. It was sold as tinctures, as pills, as syrups. It appeared in patent medicines with names like One Night Cough Cure and Dr. Brown's sedative tablets. Advertisements in newspapers and magazines touted its benefits, often with the kind of exaggerated claims common in that unregulated era. Some of these claims were justified. Cannabis genuinely helped many patients, offering relief when other medicines failed, but some were pure snake oil, capitalizing on cannabis's reputation without containing therapeutic doses or mixing it with opiates, and alcohol in ways that created addiction while claiming to cure it. The medical use of cannabis in the late 19th century was both promise and problem. The promise was genuine therapeutic benefit. The problem was inconsistency. Unlike modern pharmaceuticals with their precisely measured doses, cannabis preparations varied wildly in potency. 2 bottles of the same brand might have completely different effects because cannabis' psychoactive compounds, still unidentified and unnamed, varied depending on the plant's variety, growing conditions, and processing methods. A doctor might prescribe a cannabis tincture for a patient's migraines and have it work beautifully. The patient would return for a refill, take the new bottle at the same dose, and experience either no effect at all or an overwhelming psychoactive episode. This unreliability made many physicians wary. Why could they practice medicine scientifically if they couldn't predict a drug's effects with any precision? Moreover, new competitors were emerging. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw an explosion of pharmaceutical innovation. Aspirin was synthesized in 1897, offering reliable pain relief without psychoactive effects. Barbiturates, first synthesized in 1904, provided sedation more predictably than cannabis. Opiates, while dangerous, could be dosed with precision in ways that cannabis could not. By the early 20th century, cannabis's medical use was declining, not because it didn't work, but because newer alternatives seemed more reliable. more scientific, more modern. The medical establishment, increasingly focused on standardization and replicability, moved away from plant-based medicines toward synthetic compounds that could be manufactured to exact specifications. But even as medical cannabis faded from pharmacies, a new use for the plant was emerging, one that would prove far more controversial and consequential. Cannabis was about to become recreational. Chapter 9. The Weed of Madness. The shift from cannabis as medicine to cannabis as social menace did not happen overnight, nor did it happen for purely scientific or medical reasons. It was driven by a toxic mixture of prejudice, politics, and propaganda that turned a plant into a scapegoat for society's anxieties. The story begins, in America at least, with Mexican immigration. During the Mexican Revolution of 1910, refugees fled north across the border, bringing with them their language, their culture, and their customs. One of those customs was the recreational smoking of cannabis, which in Mexico was called marijuana or marijuana. This was not entirely new. Cannabis smoking had existed in various forms for millennia, as we have seen. But in the United States, cannabis had been primarily a fiber crop and occasionally a medicine. The idea of smoking it for pleasure was foreign, exotic, associated with people who looked different and spoke a different language. I watched as prejudice and prohibition fed on each other. In the American Southwest, where Mexican immigrants concentrated, local newspapers began running lurid stories about marijuana madness, claiming that the drug drove users to violence, sexual promiscuity, and crime. These stories were rarely based on fact. They were based on racism, pure and simple, an attempt to demonize an already marginalized population. The stories spread. Police officials, looking to justify their budgets and their authority, amplified them. Politicians, seeking an easy target, jumped on the bandwagon, and one man, above all, turned anti-cannabis sentiment into a national crusade. Harry J. Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger was a bureaucrat, a man whose power depended on the public perceiving a threat that only he could combat. When alcohol prohibition ended in 1933, he needed a new enemy, cannabis, or marijuana, as he deliberately called it. Emphasizing its foreign-sounding Spanish name became that enemy. The campaign he waged was remarkable in its cynicism and its effectiveness. He collected and publicized every sensational crime story he could find that mentioned marijuana, regardless of whether the drug had actually played any role. He gave speeches painting marijuana as a violence-inducing drug that turned normal people into murderous maniacs. He cultivated relationships with newspaper publishers, feeding them stories designed to stoke fear and outrage. "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men," he was quoted, saying in private. The racism was not incidental, it was central. The campaign against marijuana was inseparable from the campaign against Mexican immigrants and African Americans, who were also adopting cannabis use, particularly in the jazz clubs and urban neighborhoods where black culture flourished. In 1936, a propaganda film called Reefer Madness was released. I have watched it, and it is almost comical in its absurdity. Teenagers taking a puff of marijuana and immediately descending into madness, violence, and depravity. But at the time, many people took it seriously. They believed what they were told, that marijuana was a demon drug that would destroy America's youth. The campaign culminated in 1937 with the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act, which did not technically ban cannabis, but made it effectively illegal through punitive taxation and regulation. Anyone who wanted to grow, distribute, or possess cannabis had to register with federal authorities and pay substantial fees. Failure to do so was a federal crime, punishable by fines and imprisonment. The law passed with minimal debate. Few congressmen even understood what they were voting on. Some apparently believed they were banning a drug that was entirely foreign to America, not realizing that cannabis and hemp were the same plant that American farmers had been growing it for centuries. The American Medical Association actually opposed the law, with their legislative counsel testifying that cannabis had legitimate medical uses and that prohibition was premature. But their objections were swept aside in the rush to protect America from this new menace. Other countries followed America's lead. International treaties in the mid-20th century placed cannabis on lists of dangerous drugs alongside heroin and cocaine. Nations that had used cannabis medicinally and spiritually for thousands of years found themselves pressured to criminalize it by Western powers who viewed the plant through the lens of moral panic rather than scientific evidence. The prohibition that settled over cannabis in the 20th century was among the most successful propaganda campaigns in human history. Within a single generation, a plant that had been cultivated and used openly for millennia became illegal almost everywhere. Farmers who had grown hemp for fiber could no longer do so without extensive permits. Physicians who had prescribed cannabis for their patients lost access to it. Researchers who wanted to study the plant faced bureaucratic obstacles that made such research nearly impossible. But prohibition, as humans have learned countless times throughout history, does not eliminate desire. It merely drives it underground. Cannabis use continued, particularly among young people, among artists and musicians, among those who rejected mainstream society's values. In the 1960s, cannabis became a symbol of counterculture, of rebellion against authority, of a generation gap that seemed unbridgeable. I watched the hippies of that era adopt cannabis as their sacrament, passing joints at protests and rock concerts, claiming that the plant expanded consciousness and revealed the hypocrisy of a society that condemned cannabis while accepting alcohol and tobacco. They were not entirely wrong, though their embrace of cannabis was sometimes more romantic than wise. The counterculture's adoption of cannabis made the establishment's opposition even more fierce. Parents feared their children were being corrupted. Politicians promised to crack down on drug use. Police forces waged increasingly militarized campaigns against cannabis cultivation and distribution. The war on drugs, declared by President Richard Nixon in 1971, devoted enormous resources to cannabis enforcement. Millions of people were arrested for simple possession. Families were torn apart, lives were ruined, and cannabis use continued, stubbornly persistent, impossible to eradicate. During this prohibition era, something else happened that would have profound long-term consequences. Selective breeding. Growers, operating in secret, began developing cannabis strains with ever higher concentrations of THC, the psychoactive compound whose existence had finally been confirmed by scientists in the 1960s. The cannabis of the 1960s typically contained 1 or 2% THC. The cannabis of the 1990s might contain 10 or 15%. Modern strains can exceed 30%. This is not your great-grandfather's marijuana. It is a fundamentally different product, more potent, more intense, with effects that even experienced users sometimes find overwhelming. Whether this is progress or problem, remains debated. Some argue that higher potency means users can achieve their desired effects with less smoking, potentially reducing harm to their lungs. Others point to evidence suggesting that very high THC cannabis may increase risks of anxiety, paranoia, and psychological problems, particularly in young users whose brains are still developing. But these debates happened largely without good data because prohibition made research extraordinarily difficult. How can scientists study a drug that remains illegal at the federal level, that universities and research institutions are forbidden from possessing, that cannot be obtained through normal pharmaceutical supply chains? For decades, cannabis research was essentially frozen, trapped in a legal and bureaucratic ice age. The questions that should have been answered through careful scientific study. What are cannabis's actual medical benefits? What are its real risks? How do different compounds interact? What doses are therapeutic versus harmful? Remained largely unexplored. And so prohibition created a bizarre situation. Cannabis was both widely used and poorly understood. Millions of people consumed it regularly, but reliable scientific information about its effects remained scarce. It was a massive, uncontrolled social experiment, conducted on a global scale, with no one really sure what the long-term consequences might be. Chapter 10. The Molecule and the Mind. While cannabis remained illegal and stigmatized, a few determined researchers continued trying to understand it. Their work, conducted in the face of enormous obstacles, would eventually revolutionize our understanding of both the plant and the human brain. The breakthrough came in 1964 in Israel. A young chemist named Raphael Mechoulam, working at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, managed to do what scientists had been attempting for decades: isolate and identify the chemical structure of THC, DELTA, 9-tetrahydrocannabinol, the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. It was remarkable work, requiring sophisticated chemistry and considerable ingenuity. Mechoulam had to first acquire cannabis for his research, which he did through official channels, receiving 5 kilograms of confiscated Lebanese hashish from the police. Then, through painstaking extraction and purification processes, he separated THC from the hundreds of other compounds present in cannabis and determined its precise molecular structure. This discovery was crucial. For the first time, scientists knew exactly what compound was responsible for cannabis's psychoactive effects. They could now synthesize pure THC, study its effects in isolation, begin to understand how it interacted with the human body. But Mechoulam's discovery raised as many questions as it answered. THC worked. Clearly, it produced profound effects on perception, mood, memory, and consciousness. But how? What was it doing in the brain? What was it binding to? What systems was it affecting? The answer, when it came, was astonishing. In 1988, researchers at the St. Louis University School of Medicine discovered something unexpected. The human brain contains specific receptors that THC binds to. These receptors, called CB1 receptors, are found throughout the brain and nervous system, particularly concentrated in areas responsible for memory, coordination, pleasure, and time perception. The existence of these receptors was baffling. Why would the human brain have evolved receptors for a plant compound? The answer, of course, was that it hadn't. These receptors existed for something else, something the body produced naturally. THC just happened to fit into them like a key in a lock, mimicking the action of whatever natural compound they were designed for. The The search for that natural compound led to another breakthrough. In 1992, Mechalam's team isolated the first endogenous cannabinoid, a compound produced by the human body itself that binds to cannabinoid receptors. They named it anandamide, from the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning bliss or joy. The implications were staggering. The human body produces its own cannabis-like compounds. We have an entire system, the endocannabinoid system, that regulates mood, appetite, pain, sensation, memory, and many other functions. This system exists in all mammals, probably in all vertebrates. It is ancient, fundamental, essential to normal functioning. Anandamide and other endocannabinoids are produced in the body and then broken down quickly, maintaining a delicate balance. When you consume cannabis, you're flooding this system with external compounds that mimic the body's own signaling molecules, overwhelming the normal regulatory mechanisms. This discovery transformed our understanding of cannabis. It was no longer mysterious why the plant affected humans so profoundly. It was activating systems that were already there, systems that evolved for completely different purposes, but happened to be vulnerable to compounds found in this particular plant. Further research revealed that the endocannabinoid system plays crucial roles in development, learning, stress response, and emotional regulation. Disrupting it with external cannabinoids, particularly during adolescence, when the brain is still developing, could potentially have lasting effects. Supporting it with carefully dosed cannabis compounds might offer therapeutic benefits for conditions where the system is dysregulated. The science was becoming clearer, but the research remained hamstrung by prohibition. Studies were difficult to conduct, funding was hard to secure, and the cannabis available for research was often of poor quality, grown under government contracts with strains that bore little resemblance to what people were actually using. Still, evidence began accumulating. Cannabis showed promise for treating chronic pain, for controlling chemotherapy-induced nausea, for reducing muscle spasms in multiple sclerosis, for treating certain forms of childhood epilepsy. Some of these benefits came from THC, others from CBD, cannabidiol, and other non-psychoactive compounds. But the evidence also revealed risks. Heavy cannabis use, particularly during adolescence, was associated with increased rates of anxiety, depression, and in rare cases, psychotic disorders. The causal relationships were hard to untangle. Did cannabis cause these problems, or were troubled individuals more likely to use cannabis? But the correlations were concerning enough to warrant caution. What became clear was that cannabis was neither the harmless herb its advocates claimed, nor the demon drug its opponents feared. It was a powerful substance that affected a fundamental biological system with both therapeutic potential and potential for harm, and its effects varied considerably depending on dose, frequency of use, individual biology, and age of first use. But this nuanced view that cannabis was complex, that it required careful study and thoughtful regulation rather than blanket prohibition or uncritical acceptance, was difficult to communicate in a culture that had spent decades demonizing the plant. The scientific understanding of cannabis had advanced enormously, but public policy and cultural attitudes lagged far behind, trapped in patterns established decades earlier when fear and prejudice mattered more than evidence. Chapter 11. The Return. As the 20th century drew to a close and the 21st dawned, something remarkable happened. The tide began to turn. After decades of prohibition, of imprisonment and stigma, of willful ignorance masquerading as moral clarity, society began reconsidering its relationship with cannabis. The change began with medicine. Patients suffering from AIDS, cancer, multiple sclerosis, and other serious conditions reported that cannabis helped them in ways that legal pharmaceuticals could not or would not. It reduced their nausea, stimulated their appetite, eased their pain, helped them sleep. They used it not to get high, but to survive, to maintain some quality of life in the face of debilitating illness. These patients became advocates, speaking publicly about their use of an illegal substance, risking arrest to relieve their suffering. Their courage, their willingness to defy unjust laws, began to shift public opinion. It is hard to maintain that cannabis is a dangerous drug with no medical value when you are looking at a cancer patient who tells you it is the only thing that allows them to eat, to keep down their chemotherapy, to endure their treatment. In 1996, California became the first U.S. state to legalize medical cannabis. It was a watershed moment, a direct challenge to federal prohibition. Other states followed: Oregon and Washington, Alaska and Maine, one after another, each implementing systems that allowed qualified patients to access cannabis legally within their borders. The federal government resisted, insisting that cannabis remained illegal under federal law regardless of state legislation. Federal agents raided medical cannabis dispensaries, arrested growers and distributors, tried to maintain the prohibition regime, but they were fighting a losing battle. Public opinion had shifted. Polls showed clear majorities supporting medical cannabis access. The medical cannabis movement opened a door, and the push for full legalization followed. If cannabis had legitimate medical uses, the argument went, how could it be classified as a Schedule I controlled substance, a category reserved for drugs with no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse? The government's position had become logically untenable. Colorado and Washington led the way in 2012, becoming the first jurisdictions in the modern world to legalize recreational cannabis for adults. Citizens voted directly on ballot initiatives, and majorities said yes. They were willing to try a different approach to regulate cannabis like alcohol, rather than ban it outright. I watched as the first legal recreational cannabis stores opened, as people lined up to purchase legally what they had previously acquired through criminal networks. It was a strange moment, surreal in its ordinariness. Adults walking into stores, browsing products, asking questions, making purchases, and walking out again, all perfectly legal. No one was arrested. No lives were ruined. The sky did not fall. Other states followed, then other countries. Canada legalized recreational cannabis nationally in 2018. Uruguay had done so in 2013. Various European nations implemented decriminalization or limited legalization schemes. In 2020, the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs reclassified cannabis, removing it from the most restrictive category, acknowledging what scientists had been saying for years. Cannabis has medical value. The transformation was not complete. Cannabis remained illegal in most of the world, and even in places where it was legal, complex regulations governed its production, sale, and use. But the direction of change was clear. Prohibition was crumbling, eroded by evidence, by advocacy, by shifting cultural attitudes, and by the practical realization that criminalization had failed in its stated goals while creating enormous collateral damage. The legalization movement brought with it a commercial boom. What had been a black market worth billions became a legal industry worth even more. Companies sprang up to cultivate, process, and sell cannabis. Laboratories developed new products, edibles, tinctures, topicals, vaporizers, products with precise ratios of THC to CBD, products designed for specific therapeutic effects. The industry attracted investment, entrepreneurship, and all the benefits and problems that come with commercialization. On the positive side, legal businesses meant quality control, testing for contaminants, accurate labeling of potency. Consumers could know what they were getting, could make informed choices. On the negative side, commercialization meant marketing, advertising, the normalization of use in ways that concerned public health officials. Cannabis companies, like alcohol companies before them, had financial incentives to maximize consumption, to downplay risks, to target new demographics. The ghost of big tobacco loomed over the emerging cannabis industry, and the research gaps remained enormous. Despite legalization in some jurisdictions, cannabis remained illegal at the federal level in the United States, which meant most researchers still faced significant obstacles. Universities could lose federal funding if they conducted cannabis research without special permissions. The cannabis available for federally approved research remained limited and of questionable quality. So even as legalization spread, fundamental questions remained unanswered. What are the long-term health effects of regular cannabis use? How does early adolescent exposure affect brain development? What are the optimal therapeutic doses for different medical conditions? Which of the hundreds of compounds in cannabis are medically valuable beyond THC and CBD? How do different strains and preparations affect different populations? These are not abstract academic questions. They have real-world implications for millions of people who use cannabis, either medicinally or recreationally. And yet, decades after cannabis was first prohibited, decades after its primary psychoactive compound was isolated, we still lack comprehensive answers. The situation represents a peculiar failure of modern society. We have conducted a massive social experiment. Prohibition, followed by rapid legalization, without adequate scientific foundation for either policy. We banned cannabis based on prejudice and propaganda, then legalized it based on political momentum and economic opportunity, all while the careful, methodical work of science proceeded at a glacial pace, hamstrung by the very prohibitions it might have informed. But perhaps there is wisdom in acknowledging our ignorance. For thousands of years, humans used cannabis without understanding cannabinoid receptors or endocannabinoid systems, without knowing the molecular structure of THC or the neurological mechanisms of intoxication. They used it empirically, learning through experience what worked and what didn't, what was helpful and what was harmful. Modern science offers the promise of more precise knowledge, of understanding not just what cannabis does, but how and why it does it. That knowledge could lead to better medicines, to more targeted therapies, to cannabis-derived treatments that help without intoxicating, that heal without impairing. Already, drugs like Epidiolex, a CBD-based treatment for certain childhood epilepsies, show what is possible when cannabis compounds are studied rigorously and developed pharmaceutically. Children who suffered dozens of seizures daily have found relief, their lives transformed by a compound derived from a plant that, in many places, their parents could be arrested for possessing. The irony is bitter but instructive. Cannabis contains genuine medicines, but prohibition prevented us from developing them properly. Now, As legalization spreads, we have an opportunity to correct that historical error, to study this plant with the rigor and resources it deserves. But we must be cautious. The commercial cannabis industry has little incentive to fund research that might reveal harms or limitations. Governments, having criminalized cannabis for so long, are reluctant to support research that might justify their past policies. And the cultural polarization around cannabis, with passionate advocates on one side and committed opponents on the other, makes dispassionate scientific inquiry difficult. What is needed is humility, recognition that cannabis is neither miracle cure nor demon weed, but a complex plant with complex effects on a complex biological system. Recognition that thousands of years of human use have generated much wisdom, but also many misconceptions. Recognition that scientific understanding, while incomplete, offers the best path forward. The story of cannabis and human civilization is, in the end, a story about ourselves, about our capacity for both wisdom and folly, for empirical learning and willful blindness, for healing and harm. Cannabis has been our companion for 12,000 years, serving us as rope and cloth, food and medicine, sacrament and intoxicant. It has built our ships and recorded our knowledge, eased our suffering and expanded our consciousness. And now, after a century of prohibition and demonization, we are rediscovering what our ancestors knew, that this plant has gifts to offer, if we are wise enough to accept them with appropriate caution and gratitude. Chapter 12. The threads converge. I have watched human civilization for a very long time, seen empires rise and crumble, witnessed the birth of religions and the death of gods. And through all of it, through every age and every culture, one green thread has woven its way through the tapestry. Cannabis. It began in the cold highlands of Tibet, a wild plant adapting to harsh conditions, developing chemical defenses that would one day unlock doors in the human mind. It was domesticated 12,000 years ago by the first farmers, people who saw in its fibers and seeds the tools of survival. They could not have imagined where that first act of cultivation would lead. In ancient China, cannabis became rope and paper, bowstrings and clothing. It recorded the wisdom of sages and gave military advantage to archers. It was so fundamental to civilization that it was barely noticed, as essential and unremarkable as rice or water. On the steppes of Central Asia, the Scythians discovered that burning cannabis flowers produced sacred smoke, vapors that carried them to the realm of spirits and gods. They used it to commune with their dead, to seek guidance from the invisible world, to transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness. In India, cannabis became holy, associated with Lord Shiva, consumed as bhang during festivals and religious ceremonies. It was woven into the spiritual fabric of Hinduism, a plant that could release anxiety and bring joy, that could aid meditation and foster transcendence. The Ayurvedic physicians recognized its medical value, prescribing it for pain and epilepsy, for digestive troubles and nervous conditions. In China, again, Taoist monks burned cannabis incense, seeking to open the gates of perception, to communicate with spirits, to achieve the immortality that came not from living forever, but from transcending the illusion of separate self. They saw the plant as a tool, a raft to cross the river, useful but not ultimate. Along the Silk Road, cannabis traveled with merchants and mystics, adapting to new cultures, serving new purposes. In Persia, it became hashish, concentrated resin that Sufi mystics used to dissolve the ego and experience union with the divine. In Arabia, It was alternately embraced and condemned, celebrated by poets and banned by rulers, a substance too powerful to be neutral. In medieval Europe, cannabis remained primarily industrial, the fiber that built ships and enabled the age of exploration. Columbus sailed to the New World on hemp rigging and hemp sails. American colonists were required by law to grow it. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson cultivated it at their plantations, recognizing it as essential to the young nation's prosperity. Then came the Great Forgetting. In the 19th century, Western medicine rediscovered cannabis's therapeutic properties, thanks to William O'Shaughnessy's research in India. For a few decades, cannabis medicine flourished in Europe and America, sold openly in pharmacies, prescribed by physicians. But the lack of standardization, combined with the development of synthetic alternatives, led to its decline in medical practice. And then came the demonization. Cannabis became marijuana, a foreign-sounding name for a foreign menace. Racism and propaganda transformed a plant that had served humanity for millennia into a scapegoat for society's fears. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, followed by decades of increasingly punitive prohibition, drove cannabis underground, criminalized millions, and prevented the scientific research that might have revealed both its benefits and its risks. For most of the 20th century, cannabis existed in a strange twilight, widely used but officially condemned, subject to draconian penalties, yet persistent in its appeal. The counterculture of the 1960s embraced it as a symbol of rebellion, which only deepened the establishment's hostility. But throughout the Prohibition era, researchers kept working, slowly piecing together the puzzle. The isolation of THC in 1964, the discovery of cannabinoid receptors in 1988, the identification of unanandamide in 1992, the revelation that humans possess an endocannabinoid system, ancient and fundamental, that cannabis happens to interact with. These discoveries transformed our understanding. Cannabis was no longer mysterious, no longer inexplicable in its effects. It worked because it mimicked compounds our own bodies produce, because it activated systems that evolved for entirely different purposes but happened to be vulnerable to this particular plant's chemistry. And then, finally, came the return. Medical cannabis laws in the 1990s and 2000s, full legalization beginning in 2012, spreading state by state, country by country. The Great Prohibition began to crumble, eroded by evidence and advocacy, by changing cultural attitudes and practical recognition that criminalization had failed. Today, we stand at a crossroads. Cannabis is legal in many jurisdictions, tolerated in many others, but still prohibited in much of the world. The industry is booming, billions of dollars flowing into cultivation and product development. Research is expanding, slowly revealing both therapeutic potential and genuine risks. The science is becoming clearer. Cannabis affects a fundamental biological system with roles in memory, mood, appetite, pain, and much else. Its effects vary enormously depending on dose, frequency, individual biology, and age of use. It has genuine medical applications, particularly for pain, nausea, and certain neurological conditions. It also has risks, particularly with heavy use during adolescence, when the developing brain may be vulnerable to lasting changes. Cannabis is neither the harmless herb its advocates sometimes claim, nor the demon drug its opponents once portrayed. It is a powerful plant with complex effects, requiring wisdom in its use, caution in its application, and honest acknowledgement of both benefits and harms. After 12,000 years, after serving humanity as fiber and food, as medicine and sacrament, as industrial staple and spiritual teacher, cannabis has come full circle. We have rediscovered what our ancestors knew, that this plant has gifts to offer. But we have also learned what they could not, the molecular mechanisms underlying those gifts, the biological systems affected, the potential for both healing and harm. The question now is whether we can integrate this knowledge wisely. Can we develop the medical potential of cannabis while acknowledging its risks? Can we regulate it sensibly, neither banning it outright nor commercializing it recklessly? Can we study it honestly, without the distortions of either prohibition or propaganda, or legalization or marketing hype? The answer will shape the next chapter in cannabis's long relationship with humanity. And that chapter is still being written. Chapter 13, The Lessons of the Leaf. As I reflect on these 12,000 years of shared history between cannabis and humanity, certain patterns emerge, lessons that extend far beyond this single plant. First, there is the lesson of humility. For most of human history, we used cannabis empirically, without understanding how or why it worked. Ancient Chinese physicians knew that cannabis could relieve pain, but they didn't know about cannabinoid receptors. Indian yogis knew that bhang could aid meditation, but they didn't know about the endocannabinoid system. The Scythians knew that breathing cannabis smoke produced visions, but they didn't know about THC. They didn't need to know. They observed, experimented, learned from experience. They developed sophisticated understanding of cannabis's effects through trial and error, through careful attention to what worked and what didn't. Their ignorance of mechanisms did not prevent them from using the plant effectively. Modern science has revealed those mechanisms, giving us unprecedented understanding of how cannabis affects the brain and body. This is genuine progress, knowledge that can guide better use, safer practices, more targeted therapies. But it is worth remembering that for 12,000 years, humans managed perfectly well without it. There is an arrogance in assuming that scientific understanding is the only valid form of knowledge, that empirical wisdom accumulated over millennia is mere superstition until validated by laboratory experiments. Both forms of knowledge have value. Both have limitations. The wise path integrates them, using traditional knowledge to guide research questions and scientific findings to refine traditional practices. Second, there is the lesson about prohibition and human nature. Governments have banned cannabis repeatedly throughout history. The Arabian Edict of 1378, various Chinese prohibitions, the global prohibition regime of the 20th century. None succeeded for long. Cannabis use persisted, driven underground, but never eliminated. This tells us something important. When a substance provides something that humans value, pleasure, relief from suffering, altered consciousness, spiritual insight, prohibition alone cannot eliminate it. Laws can drive use into shadows, can create criminals where none existed before, can prevent open discussion and honest research, but they cannot eradicate desire. The 20th century's cannabis prohibition was, by most measures, a failure. It did not significantly reduce use. If anything, cannabis use increased during prohibition. It did create enormous harms. Millions arrested, families destroyed, lives derailed by criminal records for non-violent offenses. It prevented medical research that might have relieved suffering. It enriched criminal organizations while denying tax revenue to governments. And it erected barriers of stigma and misinformation that still complicate honest discussion. Yet prohibition succeeded in one way. It demonstrated the profound costs of criminalizing substances that large numbers of people wish to use. This lesson, painful as it was to learn, may prove invaluable in shaping more rational drug policies going forward. Third, there is the lesson about cultural attitudes and scientific truth. The shift from cannabis as accepted medicine in the 19th century to marijuana as demon drug in the 20th had almost nothing to do with new scientific discoveries about the plant's dangers. The cannabis of 1900 and the marijuana of 1940 were the same plant, with the same effects, the same benefits and risks. What changed was not the plant, but perception, driven by racism, by propaganda, by political opportunism. Harry Anslinger did not conduct research revealing new harms from cannabis. He collected sensational stories, many fabricated or exaggerated, and used them to stoke fear. The Reefer Madness campaign was not based on science, it was based on prejudice. This demonstrates how cultural attitudes can shape, distort, and sometimes completely overwhelm scientific understanding. When society decides that something is evil, evidence to the contrary is dismissed or ignored. When society decides something is beneficial, risks are minimized or denied. Cannabis has been subject to both distortions, demonization during prohibition, romanticization by some advocates today. The challenge is to see clearly through cultural biases, to evaluate cannabis honestly on its merits and demerits, to acknowledge both its genuine benefits and its genuine risks. This is harder than it sounds. We are all products of our culture, shaped by the narratives we absorb. Critical thinking requires constant effort, constant questioning of our assumptions. Fourth, there is the lesson about medicine and commercialization. Cannabis has genuine therapeutic value. This is no longer seriously disputed, but the commercial cannabis industry has financial incentives that do not necessarily align with public health. Companies profit by maximizing sales, which means encouraging use, minimizing talk of risks, marketing to new demographics. We have seen this before with tobacco and alcohol. Industries that profit from substance use cannot be trusted to self-regulate, to prioritize consumer health over corporate profit. Yet, complete prohibition, as we have learned, creates its own problems. The middle path, legal regulation, with controls on marketing, age restrictions, quality standards, and honest education about both benefits and risks, is difficult to implement, but probably necessary. It requires resisting both the prohibitionist impulse to ban what cannot be controlled and the libertarian impulse to allow unfettered commercialization. And it requires recognizing that different substances require different approaches. Cannabis is not alcohol, is not tobacco, is not heroin. Its risks and benefits are unique. One size-fits-all drug policy is as foolish as one size-fits-all medical treatment. Fifth, and finally, there is the lesson about consciousness itself. Cannabis, at its most profound level, has always been a tool for altering consciousness, for exploring the mind's hidden capacities and limitations. The Scythians seeking visions in sacred smoke, the Indian yogis using bhang to deepen meditation, the Taoist monks burning hemp incense to open perception-s gates. All were engaged in the same essential project, using a plant to change how they experienced reality. This is a fundamentally human impulse. Every culture has discovered substances, plants, fungi, fermented drinks that alter consciousness. We seek these experiences for many reasons: to escape suffering, to find pleasure, to seek insight, to explore the strangeness of our own minds. Cannabis does change consciousness, reliably and dramatically. It alters time perception, makes music more moving, food more delicious. Ordinary observations seem profound. It can induce paranoia and anxiety, or relaxation and bliss. It can enhance creativity or impair short-term memory. Its effects vary enormously between individuals and contexts. What cannabis reveals, ultimately, is that consciousness is not fixed, that the normal waking state we inhabit is just one possible configuration of neural activity, that the mind is stranger and more flexible than we typically assume. This is valuable knowledge, but also dangerous knowledge. Some who learn it become wiser, more compassionate, more aware of the arbitrary nature of cultural constructs. Others become unmoored, losing grip on shared reality, descending into solipsistic confusion. The difference, I think, lies not in the substance, but in the user, their maturity, their mental health, their intention, their context. Cannabis is a powerful tool. Like all powerful tools, it can be used wisely or foolishly, can build or destroy, depending on the hand that wields it. Chapter 14. The Green Future. And so we arrive at the present moment, and the question that faces your generation: what will you do with this ancient plant? How will you integrate cannabis into your society, your medicine, your understanding of consciousness and well-being? The old prohibitionist model is collapsing, discredited by its failures and its injustices. But what will replace it? Several possible futures lie before you, each with its own appeal and its own dangers. One future is the commercial bonanza, where cannabis becomes just another consumer product, marketed aggressively, incorporated into capitalism's endless machinery of desire and satisfaction. In this future, cannabis shops line every street. Advertising bombards every screen. Corporate conglomerates dominate cultivation and distribution. Use becomes normalized, even encouraged, with little honest acknowledgement of risks. This future would likely maximize individual freedom and generate substantial tax revenue, but it might also maximize harms, particularly to vulnerable populations, adolescents whose brains are still developing, people prone to addiction or mental health problems, communities already struggling with substance abuse. Another future is the medical model, where cannabis is treated primarily as medicine, prescribed by physicians for specific conditions, produced to pharmaceutical standards, studied rigorously. In this future, recreational use might remain criminalized, or at least stigmatized, while medical access expands based on clinical evidence. This future would maximize scientific understanding and therapeutic applications, but it might deny the reality that many people use cannabis not as medicine, but as a relatively safe intoxicant, preferring it to alcohol for relaxation or social bonding. Criminalizing recreational use while permitting medical use invites hypocrisy and abuse. People claiming medical need for what is essentially recreational desire. A third future is the regulated legalization model, treating cannabis roughly like alcohol, legal for adults, with restrictions on marketing, quality controls, age limits, and prohibitions against impaired driving. Tax revenue funds, education, treatment, and research. Use is neither encouraged nor criminalized, but regulated for harm reduction. This future attempts to balance individual freedom with public health, to permit use while minimizing harms. But regulation is difficult, too strict, and black markets persist, too loose, and commercialization runs rampant. Finding the right balance requires constant adjustment, honest assessment of outcomes, willingness to change policies when they prove inadequate. A fourth future, less likely but worth considering, is the spiritual model. In this vision, cannabis is treated as a sacrament, something used intentionally for consciousness, exploration, personal growth, and spiritual insight. Use would be contextualized within traditions of practice and teaching, passed down not through commercial channels but through communities of experienced users, helping novices navigate altered states safely and meaningfully. This future would honor cannabis's ancient role as a teacher plant, would resist its reduction to mere commodity or medical intervention, but it might be impractical in secular societies, might create two-tier systems where some have religious exemptions while others face criminal penalties. Most likely, your future will be some hybrid of these models, varying by jurisdiction, evolving over time as societies learn from experience. Cannabis policy will probably remain messy, contested, subject to constant debate and adjustment. But whatever policies emerge, certain principles should guide them. Honesty about both benefits and risks. Cannabis has genuine therapeutic value and genuine potential for harm. Both truths must be acknowledged. Marketing claims should be scrutinized. Propaganda, whether prohibitionist or promotional, should be rejected. Respect for scientific research. After decades of prohibition-induced ignorance, we need comprehensive studies on cannabis's effects, its medical applications, its risks. Research should be funded adequately, conducted rigorously, and translated into public health guidance. Protection of vulnerable populations, adolescents, pregnant women, people with psychiatric conditions. These groups face higher risks from cannabis use. Policies should protect them without criminalizing them, should educate without preaching, should offer help without judgment, justice for those harmed by prohibition. Millions have been arrested for cannabis offenses, their lives damaged by criminal records for acts that are now legal. These injustices should be addressed through expungement, release, and restoration of rights. Humility about what we don't know. Despite 12,000 years of shared history, we still don't fully understand cannabis's long-term effects, optimal therapeutic uses, or consequences of widespread hypotency use. Admitting ignorance is not weakness. It is the foundation of wisdom. And perhaps most importantly, remembering that cannabis, for all its power, is just a plant, not a panacea, not a demon, but a plant. It has served humanity in many ways as fiber and food, medicine and sacrament, teacher and companion. But it is not the answer to all questions, not the solution to all problems. The answers lie not in the plant, but in ourselves, in our wisdom or folly, our compassion or cruelty, our ability to learn from history, or our determination to repeat its mistakes. Chapter 15. The Echo That Remains. I have carried you on a long journey tonight, from the wind-swept plateau of ancient Tibet to the modern dispensaries of legalized nations, from the first Neolithic farmer noticing a useful weed to contemporary scientists mapping the endocannabinoid system. 12,000 years of history compressed into a single evening's tale. What should you remember when the details fade and only impressions remain? Remember that cannabis has been humanity's companion since the very dawn of agriculture. It is one of the oldest domesticated plants, one of our first tools for surviving and thriving. That long partnership deserves respect, deserves to be honored rather than stigmatized or commercialized without thought. Remember that every civilization that encountered cannabis found uses for it, incorporated it into daily life, and learned both its benefits and its limitations. The Chinese made paper from it, the Indians made it sacred, the Persians turned it into medicine, the Europeans sailed to new worlds on hemp rigging. This near-universal adoption suggests genuine value, genuine utility. Remember that prohibition was an historical aberration, a brief, century-long interlude in a relationship that spans millennia. It was driven not by science or medicine, but by prejudice and politics, and it failed in its stated goals while creating enormous collateral damage. This failure should inform future policies. Remember that scientific understanding, while valuable, is neither necessary nor sufficient for wise use. Our ancestors used cannabis effectively for thousands of years without knowing about THC or cannabinoid receptors. Modern science has revealed mechanisms, but mechanisms do not answer all questions. Wisdom requires integrating scientific knowledge with experiential understanding, traditional practice with contemporary research. Remember that cannabis is powerful. It affects a fundamental biological system. It can heal and it can harm. It can expand consciousness and it can impair judgment. It can be used wisely or foolishly. The substance itself is neutral. Outcomes depend on how it is used, by whom, in what context, with what intention. Remember that cultural attitudes shape reality in profound ways. The same plant that was unremarkable medicine in 1900 became demonized marijuana by 1940. Not because anything changed about the plant, but because society's perception changed. We must be vigilant against such distortions, must strive to see clearly through the fog of propaganda, marketing, and cultural bias. Remember that commercialization brings dangers. Cannabis is being transformed from a substance used occasionally for specific purposes into a consumer product. Marketed for constant use. This transformation may maximize profits, but it may not maximize well-being. We should approach cannabis commercialization with the skepticism earned from our experience with tobacco and alcohol industries. Remember that justice demands repair. Millions have been arrested, imprisoned, had their lives destroyed for cannabis offenses that are now legal. Simply legalizing the plant while leaving those injustices unaddressed is not enough. We owe those harmed by prohibition more than just the freedom to buy what was once banned. And remember, finally, that cannabis is a teacher if we are willing to learn. It teaches about the malleability of consciousness, about the difference between the map and the territory, about the constructed nature of normal perception. It teaches about plant medicine, about the coevolution of humans and the green world, about the wisdom embedded in traditional practices. But it also teaches about human nature, our capacity for both wisdom and folly, our tendency to swing between extremes rather than finding balance, our susceptibility to propaganda, and our resistance to uncomfortable truths. The story of cannabis and human civilization is, ultimately, a mirror. In it, we see reflected our own contradictions, our own complexity. We see ourselves at our best, ingenious, creative, seeking healing and transcendence. And we see ourselves at our worst, prejudiced, punitive, capable of profound injustice in the name of moral righteousness. What we do with cannabis in the coming decades will say much about what we have learned from these 12,000 years of shared history. Will we repeat the mistakes of prohibition or of thoughtless commercialization? Or will we find a middle path, one that honors both the plant's genuine gifts and our own genuine limitations? I have watched civilizations rise and fall, have seen countless experiments in how to live wisely on this earth, and I can tell you this: wisdom lies not in certainty, but in humility, not in rigid rules, but in flexible responsiveness to changing conditions, not in ignoring either benefits or risks, but in acknowledging both honestly. Cannabis has survived pharaohs and emperors, prophets and presidents. It has outlasted countless governments that tried to ban it, countless authorities that declared it evil. It survived because humans valued what it offered, because that value was real and persistent. Now, as we enter a new era in this ancient relationship, we have an opportunity that our ancestors lacked. The opportunity to use both traditional wisdom and scientific knowledge, both experiential understanding and rigorous research. We can, if we choose wisely, develop the genuine medical potential of cannabis while minimizing its risks. We can honor its sacred history while preventing its reduction to mere commodity. We can make it legally accessible to adults while protecting young people whose developing brains may be vulnerable. This will require constant effort, constant adjustment, constant honesty. It will require resisting both prohibitionist impulses and commercial pressures. It will require listening to diverse voices, medical researchers and traditional users, public health officials and patients, young people and elders. But if we can do this, if we can navigate these challenges with wisdom and compassion, then perhaps the next chapter in cannabis's long story will be one our descendants look back upon with respect rather than regret. The green thread that has woven through human civilization for 12,000 years is not about to break, but what patterns we weave with it in the centuries to come, that remains to be seen. And thus ends another memory from ages long past. If you have found a spark of wonder here, stay a while longer, for there are countless tales yet to be remembered.